Hello, my friend. Tonight we're going on a journey, not to the land of fluffy clouds or soothing rain, but deep into the shadowed alcoves of ancient Rome. You're about to uncover practices that might make your eyebrows do a vigorous jig. Things that would certainly get you cancelled faster than a TikTok trend. You probably won't survive this historical deep dive with your modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a bustling Roman street, the air thick with the scent of olive oil, sweat, and something vaguely metallic. The sounds of vendors hawking their wares, chariot wheels rattling on cobblestones, and the distant roar of the Colosseum fill your ears. But beneath this surface, you begin to sense a very different rhythm, a pulse driven by desires and social norms that would make your jaw drop. You're entering a world where sexual culture isn't hidden behind closed doors, but woven into the very fabric of daily life, often in ways that are, by today's standards, nothing short of shocking. Imagine walking past a fresco depicting explicit scenes on a public wall, or seeing statuettes of a god with an impossibly large phallus casually displayed in homes and gardens. This wasn't considered scandalous, it was just Tuesday, really. It felt as ordinary to them as seeing an advertisement for a new streaming service feels to you. For the Romans, you see, sex wasn't compartmentalized the way it is in much of the modern world. It was often viewed as a natural, even vital, part of human existence, intertwined with fertility, power, and social order. While our contemporary society often grapples with a tension between public morality and private desire, the Romans seemed to have a much more fluid, if sometimes contradictory, approach. There was a certain pragmatism to their sexuality, almost a detached efficiency, especially when it came to procreation and the continuation of the family line. But don't mistake that for a lack of passion or complexity. Oh no, the Roman heart, much like its empire, was vast and contained multitudes. They could be intensely emotional, deeply devoted, and wildly indulgent, sometimes all within the same breath. Consider this prevalent aspect of Roman life. Unlike many modern cultures, Roman society didn't generally condemn sexual acts between men, as long as the penetrative partner was the active one and of higher social status, and the receptive partner was typically a slave, a freedman, or a younger male. This isn't to say it was always celebrated, but it was certainly tolerated, existing within a clear power dynamic rather than being defined by personal preference as we understand it today. This might sound utterly bizarre to you, a direct inversion of many contemporary views, but in Rome, it was less about who you were with and more about how you conducted yourself within the established social hierarchy. A man's virility and dominance were key, and his choice of partner reflected that. It truly makes you reconsider the very definition of sexuality and how it's constructed by society. And here's a truly odd little detail that speaks volumes. The Roman fascination with the fashionum. This wasn't just any old charm. It was essentially a phallic amulet worn as jewelry, hung on doorsteps, or even incorporated into wind chimes. Its purpose, to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. Yes, you heard that right. A little phallus, dangling merrily, protecting you from the evil eye. It was thought to bring good fortune and protect against ill will, which, let's be honest, is a much more interesting and certainly more prominent use for a phallus than just, well, you know. Imagine walking around with a tiny, protective penis around your neck, a perfectly normal accessory. It gives a whole new meaning to good luck charm, doesn't it? Whether the Romans truly viewed all sexual acts as equally legitimate outside the context of marriage or procreation, or if there was an underlying, unspoken moral code that governed. Private behavior remains a point of contention among scholars today. Was their openness a sign of true liberation, a society unshackled by modern hang-ups, or simply a different, equally rigid, set of social rules governing acceptable and unacceptable behaviors? You ponder this as you observe the daily hustle and bustle, trying to peel back the layers of Roman pragmatism and understand the deeper currents of their moral landscape. It's a fascinating question, one that forces you to shed your own cultural assumptions and try to see the world through their eyes, rather than merely judging it by your own. You start to realize that what's shocking isn't just the acts themselves, but the entire framework of belief and understanding that allowed them to flourish so openly. You're not just observing, you're trying to comprehend a completely alien mindset. And believe me, it gets weirder from here. You're still standing there, processing the sheer unapologetic nature of Roman sexual expression, when your attention shifts to a more subtle, yet equally pervasive, aspect of their social fabric. Concubinage. You see, while marriage was the cornerstone of Roman family life, especially for the elite, it wasn't the only recognized form of partnership. Far from it. Concubinage occupied a fascinating, often ambiguous, space in Roman society, providing an alternative to formal marriage, particularly when a legal union wasn't desirable or possible. Think of it as a long-term, committed relationship, but without the full legal bells and whistles, a bit like a situationship that actually had codified social rules, but with a lot more historical gravitas and implications for inheritance. It was a very Roman solution to a very Roman problem. It's a well-established historical reality that concubinage was a legally recognized relationship, often involving men of higher status and women of lower social standing, such as freed or women from humbler backgrounds. Unlike a formal marriage, a concubine did not share her partner's social rank, and their children, if any, did not automatically inherit the father's status or name or his citizenship if the mother was not a citizen. This was crucial for Roman elites who needed to ensure their legitimate heirs were born of a socially acceptable match, preserving the purity of their noble bloodlines and ensuring property passed down correctly. So, while a senator might have a concubine for companionship and affection, his wife was the one who would bear his legitimate children and secure his legacy, often through carefully arranged political or economic unions. It was a very practical arrangement, designed to navigate the complexities of inheritance and social stratification without diluting aristocratic status. You can almost picture the awkward family dinners, where the concubine might be present, perhaps in the background, but certainly not at the head of the table, always aware of her specific, circumscribed place. Here's a peculiar insight into this practice. Roman emperors themselves often had concubines, openly. For example, the Emperor Vespasian, a man known for his pragmatic approach to governance, had a long-term concubine named Canis. She was a freedwoman, having once been a slave, and was known to be incredibly intelligent and influential, clearly holding a deep emotional bond with him. Yet, despite her influence and his clear affection, she could never be his legal wife due to her social standing. This highlights how personal affection could indeed exist and even thrive within these structured relationships, even if they didn't conform to the strictures of formal marriage. It's a powerful reminder that human emotions, then, as now, often find ways to bloom outside the rigid confines of societal rules. You can almost picture her whispering astute political advice into his ear. Her influence felt, though never officially acknowledged, in the same way as an empress. It was a partnership of minds and hearts, perhaps, but not of legal equals. Historians still debate whether concubinage was primarily a pragmatic arrangement driven by social and legal necessity, a way for men to have companionship without the strictures of marriage to an unsuitable match, or if it also served as an outlet for emotional intimacy that formal marriages, often arranged for political or economic reasons, sometimes lacked. Was it a secondary choice, a compromise when a formal marriage was impossible, or in some cases, a genuinely preferred one for affection without the immense pressure and expectations of a full legal union? You ponder this as you imagine the quiet moments between a concubine and her partner, far from the public eye and the formal demands of Roman society. It wasn't always just about illicit pleasure. Sometimes it was about finding a different kind of connection, a bond that existed in the liminal space between the legal and the personal. For a Roman woman of lower standing, being a concubine might even offer more personal freedom and a degree of financial security than being a wife, as she wasn't burdened by the same rigid expectations of purity and procreation for her husband's lineage. This setup, while seemingly restrictive from a modern perspective, offered a peculiar blend of intimacy and social delineation, illustrating just how flexible Roman social constructs could be when it came to managing relationships and upholding the all-important social order. You begin to understand that family in Rome was a much broader, more fluid concept than you initially imagined, with many shades of grey. As you drift deeper into the heart of ancient Rome, you realize that while concubinage offered a certain social flexibility, it pales in comparison to the sheer scale and integration of prostitution. This wasn't some hidden vice lurking in the shadows. It was a visible, often regulated, part of the urban landscape. Picture this: you're walking down a bustling street, and among the bakeries, blacksmiths, and taverns, you might spot signs or hear calls beckoning you to a brothel. It was just another business, a service industry, if you will, catering to a diverse clientele from all walks of Roman life, from slaves granted a few coins to high-ranking officials seeking discreet encounters. The very air around you seems to hum with this unspoken understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that such services were simply part of the Roman experience, as common as a visit to the forum or a trip to the local market. It really makes you wonder how different your own daily strolls would feel if public morality wasn't quite so private. It's a well-documented historical truth that prostitution was not only legal in Rome, but also widespread and, to some extent, even taxed. The Roman state didn't condemn the practice itself. Rather, it sought to regulate it, often requiring prostitutes or meretresses to register with authorities. They even paid a tax, known as the vectigal meretrissum, to the state. Imagine that, the government getting a cut of the earnings from sex work. This speaks volumes about their pragmatic approach to morality. If something was going to happen anyway, why not formalize it and make a little money? This contrasts sharply with many societies throughout history that have demonized or outlawed the practice entirely, often pushing it underground. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, understood that demand existed, and rather than fighting an unwinnable battle against human nature, they chose to manage it. This legal recognition also meant a degree of official oversight, though exactly how much protection this offered the meretresses themselves, who were largely from the lowest social strata and often enslaved, is a whole other, rather sad, story. Certainly not one of modern-day labor protections. Now, here's a curious little detail that might make you chuckle, or at least raise an eyebrow. Roman prostitutes often wore distinctive clothing, while respectable matrons wore stolas, a long, flowing outer garment, and veiled their heads. Prostitutes were sometimes required to wear a toga, the traditional garb of Roman men. This might seem utterly bizarre, like showing up to a fancy dress party in the wrong century's attire, but it effectively marked them out as distinct from virtuous women. The toga was bulky and restrictive for women, making it an uncomfortable choice, which perhaps further emphasized their lower social standing and public availability. It was a visual cue, a way of signaling their profession to anyone who might be interested, making them easily identifiable in a crowd, especially in the bustling marketplaces or near the public baths. It's like a historical uniform, but one designed to signify social status and occupation rather than, say, which fast food chain you work for. Talk about a fashion statement with a clear, if somewhat unflattering, message. You might even spot a looper, a she-wolf, or common prostitute by the way she carried herself, or the absence of the typical modesty of a Roman wife. Many academic discussions revolve around whether the Roman state's regulation of prostitution was primarily about maintaining public order and generating revenue, or if it also served to contain and control female sexuality outside of the traditional confines of marriage, particularly that of married men. Was it a form of societal release valve, allowing men to seek out sexual gratification without infringing upon the honor of their wives and daughters, thereby preserving the purity of the Roman family? Or was it simply a cynical economic policy, exploiting a readily available commodity and solidifying social hierarchies? You can almost hear the toga-clad senators debating this very point in the Curia, perhaps after a quick visit to one of the establishments they were discussing, conveniently located just a short walk from the Forum. It's a complex question, highlighting the multi-layered ways in which Roman society navigated the intersection of law, commerce, and human desire. You realize that even in something as seemingly straightforward as prostitution, there are deeper currents of social engineering at play, reflecting the Roman obsession with order, even amidst what we might perceive as moral chaos. The Roman approach to prostitution truly exemplifies their practical, almost immoral, view of human impulses. It was a service, a business, and as long as it remained within its designated social boundaries, it was largely tolerated, if not embraced. Having explored the bustling streets and the regulated world of Roman prostitution, your imaginary journey now leads you to a cornerstone of daily Roman life, the public baths. You might think of a bathhouse as a simple place for hygiene, perhaps a quick dip and a scrub, a sort of ancient version of your local swimming pool. But in ancient Rome, these massive complexes were far, far more than just glorified showers. They were social hubs, gymnasiums, libraries, restaurants, performance venues, and yes, surprisingly often, venues for various kinds of encounters, both social and sexual. Imagine a modern community center, a luxury spa, and a rather permissive club all rolled into one steamy, marble-clad establishment, operating from dawn until dusk. The sheer scale and multi-purpose nature of these places would truly astonish you. It's a fundamental aspect of Roman history that public baths, known as thermae or balnea, were central to Roman life, open to nearly everyone, from the wealthiest senators to the humblest plebeians. though often with separate sections or specific hours for men and women, or sometimes even mixed bathing. The routine was elaborate. You'd typically begin by exercising in the palestra, an open-air exercise yard, perhaps engaging in wrestling or ball games. Then, you'd move through different heated rooms, the tepidarium warm room to acclimate, followed by the intensely hot caldarium, hot room for sweating and scraping off dirt with a strigil. Finally, you'd plunge into the refreshing cold water of the frigidarium cold plunge bath. This wasn't just about getting clean. It was a full sensory experience, a daily ritual that could last for hours, a way to relax, socialize, and conduct business. The air would be thick with steam, the murmur of conversation, the splashing of water, and the occasional groan from someone getting a particularly vigorous massage or having their hair plucked out. Now, here's a rather eyebrow-raising tidbit about these bathhouses. The distinction between public and private, in terms of personal space and behavior, was much blurrier than what you're used to. While formal brothels existed, discreet arrangements, flirtations, and even more overt sexual propositions were known to occur within the bustling, often anonymous environment of the baths. There were frequently private cubicles or secluded areas, sometimes called cellae meretricia, prostitutes' rooms, within the larger complexes that could be rented for a short period. It's a bit like imagining your local swimming pool having a few VIP changing rooms with an hourly rate, but with a far more illicit purpose. The line between a casual flirtation, a business deal, and something much more intimate was constantly being blurred in these communal, often quite anonymous, spaces. You can almost picture the furtive glances, the hushed whispers, and the sly smiles exchanged amidst the steam, the echoing shouts, and the sheer clamour of hundreds of Romans going about their daily bathing routine. Academics continue to debate whether the sexual activity in public baths was merely a spontaneous byproduct of their communal nature and relaxed atmosphere, a natural overflow of human interaction, or if some bathhouses actively facilitated such encounters as an unspoken, additional service, almost a hidden feature of the facility. Were they merely places where opportunities arose due to the sheer volume of people and the relaxed social norms surrounding nudity? Or were they, in some instances, covert extensions of the city's red light districts, designed to discreetly cater to patrons' desires beyond simple hygiene? You can almost hear the moralizers of the time, like Seneca or Juvenal, wringing their hands about the decay of Roman virtue, perhaps just after they finished their own soak and massage, lamenting the very scenes you are imagining. This makes you wonder about the layers of Roman society. How much was officially sanctioned? How much was merely tolerated? And how much was simply part of the unspoken rules of engagement in a society where public and private often intersected in ways that defy easy categorization? The baths were truly a microcosm of Roman life, reflecting its blend of practicality, indulgence, and sometimes outright debauchery, all under one very large, steamy roof. From the steamy communal halls of the public baths, your journey through ancient Rome now takes you to a different kind of public space, one that reveals even more about Roman attitudes towards sexuality, the realm of erotic art and its pervasive presence in daily life. You might expect such art to be hidden away in private collections, perhaps behind velvet ropes in a dimly lit museum, or locked in some forbidden chamber. But in Rome, explicit imagery was often a surprisingly common, unhidden part of their visual culture, woven into the very fabric of their homes, gardens, public buildings, and even their religious spaces. It challenges your modern sensibilities to see such openness, such frankness in such an ancient world, where we often project our own more reserved notions of public display. It's a widely recognized archaeological fact that explicit erotic art, far from being taboo or shameful, was widely accepted and displayed in Roman society across various contexts. This wasn't just confined to brothels, as you might assume, but adorned the walls of private residences, embellished bathhouses, appeared in temples dedicated to various gods, and even decorated ordinary shops and taverns. Imagine walking into a Roman dining room or triclinium and finding vibrant frescoes depicting sexual acts as the main decorative theme, or mosaic floors showing deities like Venus and Mars in flagrante, sculptures of oversized phalluses like those used as good luck charms. Remember that fascinating tidbit from Section 1, were ubiquitous, appearing as garden ornaments, fountain spouts, or even architectural features. It wasn't primarily about being crude or titillating. It was simply another aspect of their visual landscape, often imbued with layers of meaning. Sometimes religious, celebrating fertility, sometimes humorous, sometimes just plain lusty, and often a blend of all three. This art was integrated into their environment, rather than cordoned off as something illicit. Here's a rather amusing and telling little detail that further underscores this pervasive integration. Many Roman oil lamps, those simple ceramic or bronze devices used for illumination, were often shaped like phalluses, sometimes even depicting them engaged in various sexual acts. You'd use one of these lamps to light your way through a dark alley at night, illuminate your scroll while reading a philosophical text, or simply to provide ambient light in your home. Imagine grabbing a lamp shaped like a rather enthusiastic phallus to light your evening stroll. These weren't considered shocking, scandalous, or offensive by the Romans. They were practical objects with an added layer of symbolic or humorous meaning. It's a testament to how deeply integrated and normalized sexual imagery was, transforming even mundane household items into objects that reflected their open attitudes towards fertility, pleasure, and the human body. It's almost as if they were saying, "Why wouldn't your lamp be shaped like that? It's perfectly natural, isn't it?" The question that continues to spark academic debate is whether the widespread presence of explicit erotic art reflects a genuinely permissive and uninhibited society, where such themes were simply part of everyday visual literacy, or if its public display also served as a form of social conditioning, subtly reinforcing certain power dynamics, gender roles, and the accepted norms of sexual behavior. Was it merely an unvarnished expression of human nature and religious beliefs surrounding fertility? Or was it a more subtle propaganda tool, normalizing male sexual dominance and the accessibility of certain bodies? You might find yourself pondering if the sheer ubiquity of such images eventually desensitized the Romans, making them view these depictions as simply part of the background noise of life, much like modern advertising bombards us with images. This debate pushes you to consider the deeper psychological impact of living in an environment constantly saturated with sexual imagery. It forces you to question your own assumptions about what constitutes normal or appropriate public display, and how much of our own discomfort is a product of our specific historical and cultural lens, rather than some universal moral truth. The Romans certainly didn't blush easily, at least not at their art. They simply lived amongst it. Moving from the visual landscape of Roman life, your attention now turns to the very bedrock of Roman society, marriage. You might assume that Roman marriage was a bastion of strict fidelity, a sacred union where monogamy reigned supreme, much like the idealized image you might hold from historical dramas. While the institution of marriage was indeed highly valued for its role in procreation, the legitimate continuation of the family line, and the establishment of social alliances, the expectations of fidelity, particularly for men, present a curious and often quite shocking double standard by today's measures. It's a stark reminder that even the most fundamental human relationships are shaped by deeply ingrained cultural norms that can seem alien across millennia, proving that what's traditional is always relative. It's a well-established historical reality that Roman marriage, especially among the elite, was primarily a social and economic arrangement, often involving strategic alliances between powerful families to consolidate wealth and influence. While the union gained legal recognition when the bride moved her belongings into the groom's home, ceremony often far less formal than a modern wedding. As we've noted previously, the emotional aspect was frequently secondary to practical considerations of status and lineage. For a Roman woman, absolute fidelity to her husband was an absolute, non-negotiable expectation and was legally enforced with extreme severity. Adultery on her part could lead to severe penalties, including public disgrace, forced divorce, or in some extreme historical periods and interpretations, even death at the hands of her husband or father. Her purity and the undisputed legitimacy of her children were paramount to the husband's family line and inheritance. Imagine the immense pressure on a Roman bride, her entire social standing, reputation, and indeed her very life, dependent on upholding this rigid standard of chastity. Here's a truly perplexing detail that highlights this stark double standard. A moral asymmetry that would make many a modern jaw drop, while female infidelity was harshly punished. A Roman husband engaging with prostitutes, concubines, or enslaved persons was generally not considered adultery, as long as the woman was not a respectable Roman matron or a freeborn citizen. It was a bizarre loophole that essentially sanctioned extramarital sexual activity for men, provided they sought out partners of lower social status who were not considered to be defiling another man's property or family honor. So a man could visit a brothel, maintain a concubine, or engage with enslaved individuals he owned, and his social standing and reputation would remain largely intact, even if his wife knew about it. It was like having two sets of rules for the very same game of life, one for the queen and one for the pawn. This creates a fascinating mental image of a Roman husband, perhaps returning from a night out, with his wife silently, or perhaps not so silently, aware of his escapades, yet utterly powerless to challenge them without risking her own standing or being accused of overstepping her bounds. A recurring discussion among historians centers on whether this pronounced double standard was merely a practical concession to male sexual desire, acknowledging a presumed natural male promiscuity, or if it was a deliberate and calculated mechanism to maintain the purity of the Roman family line by strictly controlling the reproductive capacities of high-status women, while allowing men a broader, safer range of sexual expression outside the legitimate family. Was it a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal dominance, or a nuanced system designed to balance individual urges with the paramount need for societal and familial order? You might find yourself shaking your head at the sheer injustice and inequality of it, yet you must try to understand the logic. However twisted it seems now, within their own cultural context, it compels you to reflect on how often power dynamics, rather than abstract notions of equality or romantic love, dictated the rules of commitment and acceptable behavior across different eras. The anxieties and fears surrounding Roman marriage, as you might recall from our shared information, were deeply rooted in these societal norms and expectations, making the wedding night a particularly fraught transition for Roman women. Having wrestled with the curious double standards of Roman fidelity, you now pivot to another aspect of Roman marital life that might surprise you with its pragmatism and, frankly, its ease: divorce. If you imagine Roman marriages as ironclad, lifelong commitments, think again. While establishing a household and ensuring its stability was paramount, the dissolution of that household, when necessary, was far less complicated than you might anticipate. It wasn't the drawn-out, often acrimonious legal battle you might associate with modern divorces. For the Romans, it could be remarkably straightforward, sometimes even casual. It's a striking historical reality that Roman divorce, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, was a relatively simple and common occurrence. Unlike many other ancient societies where divorce might require complex legal proceedings, religious annulments, or even the consent of male relatives, a Roman marriage could often be dissolved by a mere declaration of intent from either spouse. Imagine simply stating, "I divorce you," or sending a written notice, and poof, the marriage was over. This was especially true for marriages sine manu, which became increasingly common, where the wife remained legally under the control of her father or male guardian, rather than passing into her husband's family. In such cases, she could, in theory, simply return to her father's house, taking her dowry with her, and the marriage was effectively null and void. This ease of dissolution stands in stark contrast to the sanctity often associated with marriage. In other cultures and time periods, it speaks to a very different view of the marital bond, one that prioritized practical concerns and individual will over unbreakable, sacred vows. Here's a peculiar anecdote that highlights this casual approach to marital dissolution. Stories abound in Roman literature of prominent figures marrying and divorcing multiple times, sometimes for political expediency, sometimes seemingly on a whim. The statesman Cicero, for instance, divorced his long-suffering wife Terentia after 30 years of marriage, reportedly because he needed a wealthier dowry to pay off debts, and promptly married a much younger woman. This wasn't seen as particularly scandalous in terms of the act of divorce itself, though the reasons might raise eyebrows. It illustrates that for the Roman elite, marriage was often a fluid alliance, a tool in the game of power and wealth, and divorce was simply another strategic move on the chessboard of Roman society. It almost makes you wonder if they had some sort of ancient Roman equivalent of a prenup, given how easily things could be untangled. Scholars continue to debate whether the increasing ease of divorce in Rome was a sign of growing individual autonomy, particularly for women who could, in theory, initiate divorce more readily, or if it contributed to a perceived moral decay and the breakdown of traditional family values, as lamented by many Roman moralists. Was it a pragmatic adaptation to the complexities of an evolving society, or a symptom of societal instability? You can almost hear the grumbling of older generations, yearning for the good old days when marriages were supposedly more enduring. This discussion forces you to consider the double-edged sword of individual freedom versus social cohesion, a tension that still resonates today. The simplicity of Roman divorce fundamentally altered the landscape of commitment and partnership, making the stability of a Roman household, despite appearances, potentially far more precarious than you might initially assume. This fluidity in marital bonds, combined with other elements of their sexual culture, paints a picture of a society far removed from your own expectations. From the surprisingly fluid nature of Roman marriage and divorce, your exploration now ventures into an area that often causes the most confusion and projection of modern sensibilities: same-sex relations. You might carry assumptions about antiquity being uniformly repressive, or perhaps entirely open. The truth in Rome, as with so much else, is far more nuanced, reflecting a complex interplay of status, power, and prevailing cultural norms that defy simple categorization. It wasn't about gay or straight in the modern sense. It was about roles, respect, and who was doing what to whom. It's a significant historical finding that same-sex sexual activity, particularly between men, was widely acknowledged and, within certain parameters, accepted in Roman society. However, this acceptance was deeply intertwined with social status and the roles adopted during the act. The crucial distinction was usually between the active or penetrative partner, and the passive or receptive partner, the pathicus or For a free-born Roman man of status to take the active role with a male slave, a freedman, or even a younger male prostitute was generally not considered shameful or an assault on his masculinity. In fact, it might even be seen as a display of his dominance and virility. It was about exercising power, not necessarily about a fixed sexual identity. This stands in stark contrast to many later Western societies, where such acts would be condemned, regardless of social standing. Here's a peculiar social dynamic that clarifies this. While the active role was acceptable for a free Roman man, taking the passive, receptive role, especially if you were an adult, free-born citizen, was often seen as deeply shameful and effeminate. It was considered a loss of manliness, a subversion of the ideal Roman male who was always in control, always dominant. Satirists and moralists frequently mocked men who were perceived as pathogy, seeing them as weak, un-Roman, and morally suspect. So, a Roman senator could sleep with a male slave and maintain his reputation, but if he were ever caught in the receptive role, his social standing would be utterly destroyed. It was a bizarre tightrope walk where the how and the who mattered, infinitely more than the what. This makes you realize just how much Roman identity was tied to performance and appearance, particularly for men. Scholarly discourse frequently debates whether the Roman tolerance for male same-sex relations stemmed from a genuine lack of moral judgment on the act itself, focusing instead on power dynamics, or if it was merely a pragmatic acceptance of a reality that could not be suppressed, channeled into socially acceptable forms. Was it a sign of a society that didn't categorize sexuality in the way we do? Or was it a clever way for a patriarchal system to maintain control through the subtle manipulation of gender roles and expectations? You might wonder if the men who adopted the passive role truly felt the shame society heaped upon them, or if, in private, they found a different kind of freedom. This line of inquiry truly challenges your modern understanding of sexual identity and orientation, forcing you to acknowledge that historical societies often operate under completely alien frameworks of understanding human desire and interaction. The complexities involved reveal a system that was both surprisingly liberal in some respects and incredibly rigid in others. A fascinating paradox. As we previously noted from our saved information, male concubines in ancient Greece faced social stigma, limited legal rights, economic dependence, lack of institutional support, and were not afforded the social status or legal protections associated with marriage. While there are parallels, Roman nuances in power dynamics also set them apart. Having navigated the intricate power dynamics of Roman same-sex relations, your journey now takes an even more explicit, almost bizarre, turn into the religious landscape, the cult of Priapus. If you thought the phallic lamps were a curious detail, prepare yourself for a deity whose very essence was a giant, perpetually erect phallus. This wasn't some obscure, hidden sect. The worship of Priapus was a pervasive and often humorous element of Roman spiritual life, a testament to their unblushing embrace of fertility and protection. You're about to witness how deeply integrated sexuality was into even their most sacred beliefs, making your eyebrows do another vigorous jig. It's a well-established aspect of Roman religion that Priapus was a minor but widely revered god of fertility, gardens, vineyards, and indeed, male genitalia. He was typically depicted as a grotesque, often comical, figure with an enormous, permanently erect phallus. His primary role was to protect gardens from thieves and ensure bountiful harvests, and his exaggerated member was believed to possess apotropaic powers, meaning it could ward off evil and bring good luck. You'd find statues or images of Priapus, often made of wood or terracotta, prominently displayed at the entrance to gardens, orchards, and even in homes. Imagine going to pick some grapes and being greeted by a statue whose defining feature is, well, that. It certainly sent a clear message to any would-be intruders. Beware, and also, look at this. Here's a truly fascinating and rather bawdy detail about Priapus. His cult wasn't solemn or mysterious. It was often quite humorous and even vulgar. Inscriptions accompanying his statues were frequently crude, featuring explicit threats to trespassers, often involving the god's prodigious phallus. For example, a common inscription might warn a thief that if they dared to steal fruit, Priapus would punish them in a very specific, anatomical way that left little to the imagination. These were not hidden messages. They were out in the open, part of the playful yet firm guardianship of property. It's a bizarre blend of piety and lewdness, demonstrating a Roman comfort with blending the sacred and the profane in ways that would make modern sensibilities squirm. It's almost as if they were daring the thieves, with a wink and a nudge. Go on, I dare you, but don't say I didn't warn you. Scholarly inquiry often grapples with the seemingly contradictory nature of Priapus worship. How could a figure so explicitly sexual be simultaneously sacred and a protector? Was his exaggerated phallus primarily a symbol of life and abundance, a reflection of the Romans' deep connection to agricultural fertility, or was it also a veiled expression of societal anxieties about male sexual prowess and control? You might wonder if the humor associated with Priapus helped to normalize and diffuse potential discomfort with his overt sexuality, making him more palatable for widespread veneration. This exploration forces you to confront the complex ways in which ancient cultures used symbolism, humor, and religious belief to navigate fundamental aspects of human existence like procreation, property, and desire, often with a directness that makes your own era seem positively puritanical. The cult of Priapus serves as a vibrant, undeniable reminder that for the Romans, the body, its functions, and its desires were very much part of the divine order. From the overtly phallic presence of Priapus, your journey through Roman religious life now shifts to a realm of extreme, almost ascetic, sexual control, the Vestal Virgins and their perilous fate. If the image of Priapus celebrated unbridled fertility, the Vestals embodied its antithesis, enforced chastity, dedicated to the service of the state and its most sacred flame. Their lives were a paradox of immense privilege and terrifying vulnerability, bound by a vow that carried the ultimate penalty for its violation. It's a profound historical truth that the Vestal Virgins were an order of priestesses in ancient Rome, exclusively female, who served the goddess Vesta, the deity of the hearth, home, and family. Their primary duty was to maintain the sacred fire in Vesta's temple in the Roman Forum, a flame believed to represent the eternal life and prosperity of Rome itself. Losing this fire was considered a dire omen, a sign of impending disaster for the city. These women were chosen from noble families at a young age, typically between 6 and 10 years old, and served for a mandatory term of 30 years. During this period, they took a solemn vow of chastity, a requirement absolutely central to their sacred office. Their lives, while confined to the temple precincts, afforded them unique privileges. They were among the few women in Rome who could own property. They were exempt from male guardianship, a truly remarkable status for a Roman woman, and they held significant influence, even having special seating at public games. Here's a chilling and stark detail about their lives. The penalty for a Vestal Virgin violating her vow of chastity was, without exception, death by being buried alive. This was not a quick, merciful end. If a Vestal was found guilty of incestum unchastity, she would be led to a subterranean chamber on the Campus Celleratus field of wickedness near the Carline Gate, often veiled as if for a funeral, and lowered into a small cell with a lamp, a loaf of bread, water, and milk, then sealed in to die slowly by starvation. Her male paramour, if identified, would be publicly scourged to death. The horror of this punishment reflected the gravity of their role. Their chastity was seen as directly linked to Rome's safety and continued existence. It's a stark contrast to the casual acceptance of male sexual exploits, underscoring the immense weight placed on female purity when it served the interests of the state. Historians frequently debate whether the extreme punishment for Vestal unchastity was truly about religious purity and divine retribution, or if it served as a powerful, performative deterrent to maintain social order and patriarchal control over female bodies, especially those granted such immense public authority. Was the fear of this horrific death a genuine spiritual terror, or a tool of statecraft designed to ensure absolute obedience from a class of influential women? You might find yourself wondering about the psychological toll on these young girls, knowing that a single transgression, real or fabricated, could lead to such a terrifying end. This reflection underscores the immense pressures and sometimes brutal realities faced by women, even those in positions of power within the rigid framework of Roman society. A far cry from the uninhibited expressions of sexuality you've observed elsewhere in the city. The Vestals truly represent the ultimate frontier of sexual control within Roman culture, a sacred cage with golden bars. From the extreme self-denial of the Vestal Virgins, your perspective shifts again, this time to the attempts by Roman authorities to impose control not just on individuals, but on broader societal behaviors, sumptuary laws, and their efforts to regulate desire. You might imagine that a society so seemingly uninhibited would simply let everyone indulge as they pleased. But time and again, Roman leaders, particularly moralistic censors, tried to rein in perceived excesses, including those related to sexual indulgence, through legislation. These laws were often as much about social control and upholding traditional values as they were about economics, trying to put a cap on what Romans could spend, wear, or even eat, all with an eye on the moral fiber of the Republic. It's a well-documented historical phenomenon that the Roman Republic, especially in its later centuries and into the early empire, enacted various sumptuary laws. These laws aimed to curb extravagant spending on banquets, clothing, jewelry, and even funeral arrangements. While not directly targeted at sexual acts, these laws were often driven by a broader concern for public morality and a desire to maintain traditional Roman virtues, which included moderation and austerity. The idea was that excessive luxury led to moral decay, and this decay, in turn, corrupted the citizens and weakened the state. Think of it as the government trying to tell you, hey, stop buying so many fancy clothes and throwing those wild parties. It's bad for the economy and your soul. These laws reveal a deep-seated anxiety about the corrupting influence of wealth and pleasure on what they idealized as the old Roman virtues of simplicity and discipline. Here's a peculiar attempt at regulation that underscores the specific concerns of these laws. Some sumptuary laws even tried to dictate the number of courses at a dinner party or the type of food that could be served, particularly meat. While this might seem aimed purely at gastronomic excess, it was also implicitly about limiting opportunities for lavish, extended feasts that could easily devolve into drunken orgies or opportunities for illicit encounters. If you couldn't serve peacock tongues or too many kinds of rare fish, perhaps you'd be less inclined to invite guests whose primary interest was debauchery. It's a rather roundabout way of controlling sexual behavior by trying to choke off the luxurious environments that might foster it. You can almost picture Roman party planners trying to cleverly navigate these rules, finding loopholes to keep their guests entertained, perhaps by serving smaller portions of more expensive ingredients. Sorry, only 5 courses tonight, but each one is exquisitely rare. A central question for historians regarding sumptuary laws is whether they were genuinely effective in curbing moral decline and excessive indulgence, or if they were largely symbolic gestures by a conservative elite, frequently ignored or circumvented by a populace eager for pleasure. Did these laws genuinely reshape behavior, or did they merely provide a platform for moralizers to express their disapproval of changing social norms? You might wonder if such laws ever truly extinguished desire, or simply pushed it into more clandestine and perhaps more inventive forms. This debate highlights the eternal struggle between legal prohibition and human nature, and how often attempts to legislate morality end up being little more than a whisper against the roaring tide of societal trends. Despite the Roman efforts, their history suggests that desire, in all its forms, found a way to thrive, often mocking the very laws designed to contain it. Having seen the Roman state's attempts to legislate morality through sumptuary laws, your attention now turns from legal strictures to scientific understanding, or at least what passed for it in antiquity. Medical views on sex, you might expect. Their understanding of the human body and its desires to be primitive, perhaps riddled with superstitions. While some of their theories might indeed make you chuckle, Roman medicine, often heavily influenced by Greek thought, attempted to categorize and understand sexual health and desire, even if their methods and conclusions were vastly different from anything you'd recognize today. It's a fascinating peek into how ancient minds grappled with the very mechanics of human biology and pleasure. It's a well-established fact from ancient texts that Roman physicians, like their Greek predecessors such as Hippocrates and Galen, viewed sexual activity as an important aspect of physical and mental health. They believed that bodily fluids, including semen, were crucial to a person's well-being. For men, retention of semen was often thought to lead to various ailments. while excessive indulgence could also deplete the body's vital forces. Therefore, a balance was key, a moderate release considered healthy, necessary even. This wasn't just about pleasure. It was about maintaining the body's equilibrium, much like balancing the humors. Imagine your doctor prescribing a certain frequency of sexual activity, not for romantic reasons, but purely for your physiological benefit. Here's a peculiar medical belief that might make you scratch your head. Some Roman medical texts suggested that female sexual desire, if left unfulfilled, could lead to a condition they called wandering womb or suffocation of the womb hysteria. The womb, they believed, was an organ capable of moving around the body, causing all sorts of symptoms from anxiety to physical discomfort, all because it was yearning for moisture or reproductive activity. The proposed cure often involved marriage, pregnancy, or sexual intercourse to anchor the womb back in place. It's a rather imaginative, and frankly quite sexist, explanation for a myriad of female complaints, but it reveals how deeply intertwined their medical theories were with societal expectations about women's roles and functions. You might even find yourself stifling a giggle at the thought of a Roman doctor trying to physically push a wandering womb back into place. A point of ongoing academic discussion is whether these Roman medical theories, particularly those concerning female sexuality and hysteria, were genuine scientific attempts to understand the body, or if they were largely cultural constructs that reinforced patriarchal control over women's bodies and behaviors. Did physicians truly believe in a mobile uterus? Or did these theories provide a convenient medical justification for societal pressures on women to marry and bear children? You might ponder how much of what we consider science today is similarly influenced by our own cultural biases, however unconsciously. This examination into ancient medical thought highlights how profoundly the prevailing social norms and gender roles of an era can shape even its most supposedly objective scientific inquiries, creating a fascinating blend of observation, speculation, and cultural reinforcement when it came to understanding human desire and its physiological manifestations. From the curious medical theories concerning human desire, your journey now plunges headfirst into the legendary Roman pursuit of pleasure, orgiastic feasts, and excessive indulgence. You've likely heard whispers of Roman banquets overflowing with exotic foods and wine, but the reality often went far beyond mere culinary delight, transforming into spectacles of uninhibited revelry where social boundaries blurred and desires ran wild. Imagine the most lavish, unrestrained party you can conceive, then multiply it by 10. Add a few more courses and remove most of the clothes. It's a well-known historical fact that lavish banquets were a cornerstone of Roman elite social life, serving not only as occasions for dining but also as opportunities for displaying wealth, solidifying political alliances, and engaging in sophisticated, or sometimes utterly crude, entertainment. These were not quick meals. They were elaborate, multi-course affairs lasting for hours, often stretching late into the night. Guests reclined on couches, being served by numerous slaves, while musicians, dancers, acrobats, and even poets performed. The sheer volume of food and wine consumed was often staggering. Imagine an ancient Roman version of a Michelin star restaurant, collaborating with a Las Vegas show and then adding a wild after-party that went on until dawn, complete with philosophical debates turning into drunken arguments, and then, often, into something far more intimate. Here's a rather shocking and widely attested detail about these feasts. It wasn't uncommon for Romans, particularly those of means, to intentionally induce vomiting during banquets to make room for more food and drink. The philosopher Seneca, for instance, famously derided those who vomit that they may eat, and eat that they may vomit. While perhaps not a universal practice at every dinner party, the very fact that this was a recognized, if criticized, behavior speaks volumes about the extreme lengths to which some Romans would go in their pursuit of gluttony and sustained indulgence. It truly puts a new spin on the phrase eating your fill, doesn't it? This practice allowed them to prolong the experience of pleasure, bypassing the natural limits of their stomachs to continue the feasting, and implicitly, the revelry that accompanied it. A recurring point of scholarly contention is whether the accounts of truly orgiastic Roman feasts, those involving explicit sexual activity, among guests are reliable historical representations or exaggerated literary tropes, embellished by moralizing authors like Juvenal or sensationalized by later writers. Were these truly common occurrences at elite Roman dinner parties, or were they extreme, isolated incidents blown out of proportion to illustrate the perceived moral decay of the era? You might ponder if such wild abandon was an accepted part of high society, a kind of sophisticated debauchery, or if it was more often confined to specific, less respectable gatherings. This debate prompts you to consider the biases in historical sources and how much of what we believe about the past is colored by the agendas of those who recorded it. Regardless of their exact frequency, the very idea that such events were even conceivable, much less depicted, tells you a great deal about the boundaries of Roman excess and their complex relationship with pleasure. From the excesses of Roman banquets, your journey now shifts to a darker, more somber aspect of Roman sexual practices, the grim reality of slaves and sexual exploitation. While much of what you've observed so far has focused on the choices and societal structures of free Romans, the lives of the enslaved presented a starkly different picture, one where personal autonomy, including sexual autonomy, was virtually non-existent. This is where the pragmatic, often brutal, efficiency of Roman society reveals its most dehumanizing face. It's a harsh, undeniable historical truth that slavery was endemic to Roman society, forming its very economic backbone, and enslaved individuals were considered property, not persons. As property, they had no legal rights, and their bodies were entirely at the disposal of their owners. This meant that sexual exploitation was not only rampant, but also entirely permissible under Roman law. Enslaved men, women, and children could be, and often were, used by their owners, their guests, or even rented out for sexual purposes without their consent. Imagine a world where your very being, your body, is not your own, but a commodity to be used and traded as seen fit by another. This inherent lack of agency for enslaved people stands as one of the most brutal realities of the Roman system, fundamentally shaping their experience of sexuality, or rather, its violent absence. Here's a disturbing detail that underscores the systematic nature of this exploitation. Enslaved individuals were sometimes specifically trained or acquired for sexual services, whether for their owner's household pleasure or for profit in brothels, which were often run by free citizens who owned and managed enslaved prostitutes. These enslaved individuals were referred to by various terms, some quite dehumanizing, reflecting their status as objects. Owners could also loan or rent out their enslaved people for sexual purposes, treating them as income-generating assets. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was an ingrained, accepted part of the institution of slavery. The complete lack of recourse, the absolute power imbalance, meant that sexual abuse was a constant, terrifying threat for countless enslaved men, women, and children. It really puts a chill down your spine to consider the systematic nature of such profound dehumanization. Historians vigorously debate the full extent and everyday nature of sexual violence against enslaved people in Rome, especially given the relative silence of the victims in surviving historical records. Was the widespread availability of enslaved bodies for sexual use a significant factor in shaping the sexual norms and expectations of Roman free citizens, contributing to the double standards for free women and the casual male promiscuity? Or was it merely a dark but contained consequence of the overall brutal institution of slavery? You might find yourself contemplating the long-term psychological impact on both the enslaved and the enslavers, and how such a system could possibly coexist with the sophisticated legal and philosophical advancements for which Rome is also known. This facet of Roman society serves as a stark reminder that beneath the grandeur of the empire, profound injustices and systematic exploitation were woven into the very fabric of daily life, making the shocking aspects of free Roman sexuality seem almost tame by comparison. Having confronted the grim realities of sexual exploitation within Roman slavery, your focus now shifts to the minds that pondered such societal structures, those who sought to articulate deeper truths, philosophers on pleasure. You might assume that Roman thinkers, with their emphasis on virtue and duty, would outright condemn all forms of carnal pleasure. Yet, the reality is more nuanced. Various philosophical schools grappled with the role of desire, enjoyment, and bodily satisfaction in the pursuit of a good life, leading to a fascinating spectrum of views that often directly addressed, or at least implicitly touched upon, sexual practices. It's a key historical insight that Roman intellectual life was deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism, each offering different perspectives on pleasure. Voluptas in Latin. Stoics, like Seneca and Epictetus, generally advocated for emotional control and detachment, viewing excessive pleasure as a distraction from virtue and reason. For them, true happiness came from living in accordance with nature and controlling one's desires rather than indulging them. They wouldn't necessarily condemn sex for procreation within marriage, but would warn against its pursuit for mere gratification, seeing it as a slippery slope to moral weakness. It was all about maintaining that rigid self-control. Like a mental muscle, you constantly had to flex to stay in shape. Here's a paradoxical philosophical approach that might surprise you. While Stoics preached austerity, the Epicureans, often misunderstood as advocating for hedonism, actually promoted a more subtle and refined form of pleasure. True Epicurean pleasure, as taught by figures like Lucretius, whose famous poem De Rerum Natura explores the nature of the universe, was not about wild indulgence, but about the absence of pain and disturbance, ataraxia, and the quiet joys of friendship, intellectual pursuit, and simple physical comforts. While they recognized bodily pleasure, they warned against excesses that would lead to future pain or anxiety. So, for an Epicurean, a quiet, intimate moment might be more pleasurable than a raucous, orgiastic feast, simply because it led to greater tranquility. It's a bit like choosing a perfectly brewed cup of tea over a massive sugar rush that inevitably leads to a crash. Scholarly analysis often explores whether Roman philosophical discussions on pleasure truly influenced everyday sexual practices, or if they remained largely theoretical debates confined to elite intellectual circles. Did the average Roman citizen, caught up in the pragmatic realities of daily life, give much thought to Seneca's admonitions or Lucretius's subtle distinctions? Or were these philosophical stances primarily intellectual exercises for the educated few, with little real impact on the broader currents of Roman sexual behavior. You might ponder if these philosophers were trying to shape their society, or merely reacting to the excesses they observed around them. This enduring question prompts you to consider the enduring gap between lofty ideals and lived realities, and how often philosophical pronouncements, however profound, struggle to bend the deep-seated currents of human desire and societal norms. Their ideas provide a fascinating lens through which to view Roman sexual culture, even if they sometimes reveal more about the aspirations of a few than the habits of the many. From the lofty, sometimes contradictory, musings of Roman philosophers on pleasure, your journey now shifts to another vibrant medium through which Roman sexuality expressed itself: erotic literature and poetry. If you're imagining dry, academic tomes, think again. Roman writers, from the witty to the outright crude, left behind a treasure trove of verses, plays, and prose that explored desire, love, seduction, and explicit sexual encounters with a frankness that can still surprise you. Today, it was a world where passion, longing, and lust found their voice in elegant Latin verse, often meant to be read aloud or performed, adding another layer to their already uninhibited culture. It's a significant fact from literary history that Roman literature, especially poetry, is remarkably rich in erotic themes, often featuring explicit sexual content that ranges from tender declarations of love to graphic depictions of sexual acts. Poets like Catullus explored intense, personal passions, including his tumultuous affair with Lesbia, likely Claudia Metelli, with both raw emotion and sharp wit. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, offered playful, cynical, and highly detailed advice on seduction, picking up partners, and maintaining relationships, all peppered with suggestive scenarios. Even more surprisingly, works like Martial's epigrams are filled with biting satire and explicit descriptions of sexual activities, often without euphemism. This isn't just a few isolated verses. It's a substantial body of work that demonstrates a widespread comfort with discussing and depicting sexual matters in a public, literary forum. Here's a delightfully scandalous detail from this literary landscape. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a sort of ancient Roman pickup artist manual, was so notorious that it contributed to his eventual exile by Emperor Augustus. Now Augustus was trying to promote a return to traditional Roman values. And Ovid's guidebook on how to cheat on your spouse and enjoy illicit affairs was probably not helping his cause. Imagine a poet getting essentially cancelled and banished for writing a scandalous dating manual. This wasn't merely about the erotic content. It was about the perceived moral damage it inflicted on society, at least in the eyes of the emperor. It's a testament to the power of words, even then, to stir both admiration and intense condemnation. You can almost picture Augustus furiously tearing out pages, muttering about the youth of Rome being corrupted. Academics frequently debate whether the explicit nature of Roman erotic literature simply reflected the actual sexual mores of the time, mirroring a society truly uninhibited in its private and public conduct, or if these works were often exaggerated for satirical effect, artistic license, or as a form of intellectual rebellion against more conservative elements. Were these poems and plays a mirror of Roman life, or a funhouse mirror, distorting reality for entertainment? You might consider how often modern media sensationalizes certain aspects of life, and whether ancient authors did the same. This discussion prompts you to critically examine the relationship between art and reality, and how literary depictions, even when seemingly straightforward, can be layered with irony, satire, and the author's own agenda. Regardless, the sheer volume and frankness of this body of work provide an invaluable, if sometimes challenging, window into the sexual attitudes and imagination of the ancient Romans. From the vivid verses of Roman erotic literature, your journey now flows into a realm where inhibitions dissolve under the intoxicating influence of revelry and altered states, Bacchus, and the pervasive impact of wine. You've already touched upon the excesses of Roman feasts, but the worship of Bacchus, the god of wine, fertility, ritual madness, and ecstasy, took indulgence to an entirely new, often wild, level. It was more than just drinking. It was a religious experience, a deliberate shedding of societal constraints that often led directly to uninhibited sexual expression. It's a well-established aspect of Roman religious and social history that Bacchus, known as Dionysus in Greek mythology, was a hugely popular deity whose cult involved ecstatic rituals and copious consumption of wine. Unlike the more orderly state cults, Bacchic rites, known as Bacchanalia, were often held in secret, particularly in their earlier forms, and were characterized by frenzied music, dancing, and indeed, heavy drinking. The belief was that through intoxication and collective ecstasy, worshippers could achieve a state of furor divinus divine, madness allowing them to transcend their ordinary selves and connect directly with the divine. This altered state frequently led to the abandonment of social norms and moral restraints, including those related to sexual conduct. Imagine attending a gathering where the explicit goal was to lose yourself, both mentally and physically, in a communal outpouring of sensation. Here's a startling historical incident that highlights the Roman authorities' deep unease with uncontrolled Bacchic revelry. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree severely suppressing the Bacchanalia. The official reason given was concerns about widespread moral corruption, criminal conspiracies, and scandalous sexual activity occurring during these nocturnal rites. Livy, a Roman historian, describes lurid scenes of debauchery, including orgies, forged documents, and poisonings, though it's likely he exaggerated for dramatic and moralistic effect. Regardless of the precise truth, the state's extreme reaction demonstrates that these cult activities were perceived as a genuine threat to public order and traditional Roman morality, precisely because they enabled such radical departures from accepted sexual and social behavior. It's almost as if the authorities were saying, "Your divine madness is messing with our divine order." Scholarly inquiry often delves into whether the Roman suppression of the Bacchanalia was truly a response to genuine widespread criminality and sexual excess, or if it was more about political control or fear of large, unsupervised gatherings that could undermine traditional authority and social hierarchy. Was the sexual liberation a genuine part of the religious experience, or merely a convenient excuse for authorities to crack down on a perceived threat to stability? You might consider how often fears about moral decay mask deeper anxieties about social unrest. This discussion encourages you to look beyond superficial explanations and examine the underlying power dynamics at play. Regardless of the Senate's precise motivations, the fact remains that Bacchus and the potent influence of wine provided a powerful pathway for Romans to temporarily step outside the bounds of their structured lives and indulge in passions that were otherwise kept somewhat in check, creating spaces where the shocking could become momentarily normal. From the intoxicating grip of Bacchus, your journey now pulls you into a place frozen in time, offering an unparalleled glimpse into the very heart of Roman sexual commerce, the Lupaina of Pompeii. Unlike the general observations you've made about prostitution or the hints of encounters in the baths, here you will step directly into a purpose-built Roman brothel, preserved with chilling detail by the eruption of Vesuvius. It's a snapshot, almost voyeuristic, into a specific, tangible site where these shocking practices unfolded daily. It's an extraordinary archaeological discovery that the city of Pompeii, buried by volcanic ash in 79 CE, contains the most complete, surviving Roman brothel, known as the Lupaina from lupa, meaning she-wolf, a slang term for prostitute. This two-story building, located just a short walk from the Forum, features 10 small rooms or cells, 5 on the ground floor and 5 upstairs, each with a stone bed. The walls of the Lupaina are adorned with vivid, explicit frescoes depicting various sexual positions and acts. These weren't subtle hints. They were explicit advertisements, functioning almost like a menu of services available, illustrating the specialties of the house. Imagine walking into a modern establishment and seeing its offerings displayed in such a direct, artistic manner. The presence of these frescoes provides undeniable evidence of the services offered and the straightforward commercial nature of Roman prostitution. Here's a poignant and telling detail. You'll notice in the Lupaina, in addition to the explicit frescoes, many of the rooms feature scratched graffiti on their walls, left by both patrons and the prostitutes themselves. These are not grand declarations, but often simple names, dates, or even short, crude comments. Some graffiti include boasts from clients about their sexual prowess, while others are lamentations or simply the names of the prostitutes. This ephemeral writing offers a raw, unfiltered human element to the cold stone, a whisper from the past. That adds a layer of stark reality to the lives lived and often endured within those small rooms. It's a chilling reminder of the anonymous transactions and desperate lives that unfolded in these spaces. Human stories etched into the very walls. Archaeologists and social historians frequently ponder whether the Lupaina of Pompeii represents a typical Roman brothel, a standardized model found across the empire, or if its detailed preservation makes it an exceptional, perhaps even exaggerated, example. To what extent can one specific site inform our understanding of prostitution across the vast Roman world? You might find yourself wondering about the daily lives of the enslaved women and men who worked there, if they were able to carve out any semblance of personal life amidst their exploitation. This discussion pushes you to consider the limitations of archaeological evidence and how unique discoveries, while illuminating, must be carefully contextualized. Nonetheless, the Lupaina provides an invaluable, albeit unsettling, direct window into the commercial realities of Roman sexuality, allowing you to almost touch the raw edges of their ancient desires and the lives they shaped. Stepping away from the stark, preserved reality of the Lupaina, your exploration of Roman intimate life now shifts to the fundamental act that ensured the very continuation of their society: childbirth and the fertility rituals that surrounded it. For the Romans, progeny wasn't just a personal choice. It was a civic duty, essential for the family's legacy and the strength of the state. As such, the processes of conception, pregnancy, and birth were imbued with deep cultural and religious significance, often involving practices that sought to invoke divine favor for successful procreation. It's a cornerstone of Roman social structure that fertility and the bearing of children, especially sons, were paramount. For Roman women, marriage was primarily for procreation, and motherhood was considered their most honorable and essential role, a Roman wife's status and security. Within her husband's household often depended heavily on her ability to produce heirs. Consequently, infertile couples, or those struggling to conceive, would often turn to a variety of religious rituals, prayers, and offerings to various deities associated with fertility and childbirth. Imagine the immense pressure on a Roman bride to conceive quickly, the whispers and anxieties if a year or two passed without a pregnancy. The entire future of the gens, the family lineage, rested, quite literally, on her womb. Here's a peculiar ritualistic detail that highlights their fervent desire for offspring. The Lupercalia festival, celebrated annually on February 15th, involved priests known as Luperci running through the streets of Rome, clad only in goatskins, and gently striking women bystanders with strips of hide from sacrificed goats. Far from being a painful ordeal, this was considered a highly auspicious act. Women, particularly those hoping to conceive or have an easier childbirth, would actively present themselves to be struck, believing it would confer fertility and alleviate labor pains. It's a bizarre, almost comical scene by modern standards, but for the Romans, it was a deeply symbolic and potent ritual, a tangible connection to ancient pastoral traditions, believed to guarantee the vitality of the community and its members. You can almost hear the giggles and excited chatter of the women lining the streets, eagerly awaiting their ritualistic slap. Many scholarly discussions consider whether these elaborate fertility rituals and the societal pressure to bear children were primarily driven by genuine religious belief and a desire for familial continuity, or if they were also a powerful mechanism for controlling female sexuality and ensuring women fulfilled their designated reproductive roles within a patriarchal society. Did these practices empower women in their role as mothers, or did they simply reinforce their primary function as childbearers? You might ponder how different your own relationship with your body and reproductive choices would be if sacred ceremonies dictated your fertile future. This examination forces you to look beyond the surface actions and consider the underlying societal motivations, recognizing that Roman concepts of honor and duty were deeply intertwined with an understanding of sexuality and the divine purpose of human reproduction. The anxieties and fears surrounding Roman marriage, as you might recall, were certainly heightened by this intense focus on producing heirs. Having explored the solemn rituals surrounding childbirth and fertility, your journey into Roman sexual practices now takes a turn towards a more pragmatic, though often dangerous aspect: contraception and abortion methods. You might assume that without modern science, ancient Romans were entirely at the mercy of chance when it came to procreation. However, archaeological and literary evidence reveals that they possessed a surprisingly wide array of methods, albeit crude and often ineffective or harmful by today's standards, to prevent conception or terminate pregnancies. This reflects a desire for control over their bodies and family size that transcends technological limitations. A fascinating historical finding confirms that the Romans, borrowing heavily from Greek medical knowledge, employed various methods of contraception. These included both barrier methods and orally ingested concoctions. For instance, some texts describe the use of olive oil, cedar gum, or even lead ointment applied vaginally, possibly acting as spermicides or physical barriers, though the latter would have been incredibly toxic. More common were plant-based remedies, with herbs like silphium, a plant highly valued for its contraceptive properties, now believed to be extinct due to overharvesting, pennyroyal, or Queen Anne's lace wild carrot being consumed as drinks, or pessaries. Imagine relying on a particular herb, possibly with unknown side effects, to plan your family. The very existence of such diverse methods underscores a clear intent among at least some Roman women and men to manage fertility and family size. Whether for health reasons, economic concerns, or simply personal preference, here's a disturbing detail about these ancient practices. While some contraceptive methods aimed to prevent conception, others were clearly abortifacients, designed to induce miscarriage. Strong herbal concoctions, often made from plants like savin or rue, were ingested, sometimes in highly potent doses. These methods were frequently dangerous, posing significant risks to the woman's health, including severe illness, hemorrhage, and even death. The lack of precise dosages, understanding of toxicology, or sterile conditions meant that even successful abortions often came at a terrible cost. This reliance on potent, sometimes poisonous, herbs highlights the desperate measures women might resort to when faced with an unwanted pregnancy, revealing a stark and perilous aspect of their reproductive lives. It makes you realize the sheer courage, or perhaps desperation, involved in navigating personal choice in an era without modern medical safety nets. Scholarly debate often centers on the moral and ethical attitudes towards abortion in Roman society, particularly given its apparent widespread practice. Was abortion viewed primarily as a medical procedure, a woman's personal decision, or was it seen as morally questionable, even if not strictly illegal in all circumstances? While it wasn't criminalized in the same way as infanticide, some Roman legal texts suggest that a husband could sue his wife if she aborted a child without his consent, as it deprived him of a legitimate heir. This indicates that while the physical act might have been tolerated, the legal and social implications could be complex, often tied to a husband's patriarchal rights. You might wonder how much of the Roman silence on the moral condemnation of abortion reflects a practical acceptance, and how much is simply lost to the biases of surviving male-authored texts. This discussion compels you to reflect on how deeply intertwined reproductive control is with prevailing power structures and societal values, a complex issue that continues to resonate through the ages. Long after the last Roman herbwife brewed her potent draught, having explored the often perilous methods of reproductive control, your journey through Roman society now shifts to a more outward display of intimacy, public displays of affection. You might imagine a reserved, stoic people keeping their emotions firmly under wraps. Yet the Romans, while valuing decorum, also possessed a comfort with public expressions that might genuinely surprise you, particularly when it came to platonic affection and, in certain contexts, even romantic or sexual overtures. It challenges your preconceived notions of ancient modesty. It's a well-observed fact from Roman art and literature that physical touch and close proximity were common and accepted in public life. Friends and family members, both male and female, would often walk arm in arm, embrace warmly, or hold hands without a second thought. This wasn't necessarily romantic. It was a common sign of camaraderie, friendship, and social bond. Imagine seeing two adult male senators walking down the forum arm in arm, discussing politics, completely at ease. This level of physical intimacy among non-romantic pairs is often less common in many modern Western cultures, where personal space is more rigidly defined. For the Romans, touch was a much more integrated part of social interaction, a language of connection that spoke volumes about relationships, whether familial or platonic. Here's a striking anecdote that illustrates the bounds of Roman public affection. The poet Martial, in his epigrams, casually mentions lovers kissing in public, even in crowded spaces, while full-blown sexual acts were certainly not performed openly in the forum. Discreet kisses, embraces, and flirtatious gestures were clearly part of the urban landscape. Imagine a couple sharing a tender moment amidst the hustle and bustle of a Roman market, perhaps stealing a kiss behind a stall or whispering endearments in a quiet corner of a public garden. This wasn't seen as scandalous or attention, but simply a normal part of human interaction, a small, fleeting expression of affection in the midst of daily life. It's a pleasant contrast to some of the harsher realities you've encountered, reminding you that even in a society with different moral codes, the tender impulses of human connection still found a way to manifest. Among historians, there's a nuanced discussion about the precise boundaries of acceptable public display of affection. Was the Roman comfort with physical intimacy truly about a more relaxed attitude towards public decorum, or did it subtly reinforce social hierarchies, with certain types of touch and interaction being permissible only between specific statuses? One might ask if the lack of condemnation for male affection was a genuine acceptance of intimacy, or simply overlooked because it didn't challenge patriarchal dominance, provided it stayed within the active-passive framework we discussed earlier. This invites you to consider how cultural comfort with public touch can both reflect genuine openness and mask underlying social distinctions. The Roman street, then, wasn't just a place of commerce and politics. It was a stage where the complex tapestry of human relationships, in all their varied forms, was continuously, and often quite physically, performed. From the surprisingly tactile world of public affection, your journey now veers into the mystical and often irrational side of Roman desire, magical practices for love. While the Romans were known for their practical engineering and legal systems, they were also deeply superstitious, and matters of the heart, particularly those involving unrequited longing or vengeful jealousy, often led them to seek help beyond the mundane. You're about to uncover a shadowy realm of spells, curses, and charms designed to ignite passion, bind lovers, or inflict romantic torment. It's a well-documented aspect of Roman folk religion and magic that various forms of love, magic were commonly practiced across all social strata. These weren't sophisticated rituals, but rather a mix of traditional beliefs, imported mystical practices, and simple folk remedies. People sought out specialists, magicians, sorcerers, or even just cunning women to create love charms, philtra, or binding spells, defictions, or curse tablets. These spells aimed to achieve a range of outcomes: to make someone fall in love with you, to ensure your lover's fidelity, to break up a rival's relationship, or even to inflict sexual impotence on an enemy. Imagine desperately wanting someone's affection and resorting to burying a lead. Tablets inscribed with their name and a curse in a hidden graveyard, hoping unseen forces would bend their will. Here's a peculiar detail about these magical practices. Many Roman love spells involved the use of unusual, sometimes gruesome, ingredients and intricate symbolic actions. This could include burning specific herbs, tying knots, using animal parts, or even drawing images on wax dolls representing the target of the spell. Some binding spells called for hair, fingernail clippings, or even fragments of clothing belonging to the desired person. The idea was to create a sympathetic link between the ritual and the individual, forcing their will to align with the spellcaster's desire. It's like a macabre version of a modern dating app, but instead of swiping right, you're trying to physically manipulate someone's destiny through sympathetic magic. It truly makes you wonder about the desperation and belief that fueled such elaborate, often chilling, rituals. An ongoing area of research among classicists is the extent to which these magical practices genuinely reflected a belief in supernatural influence over love and desire, or if they were largely psychological tools, empowering the spellcaster and perhaps intimidating the target through rumor and superstition. Did the Romans truly believe a piece of cursed lead could compel someone's affection? Or did the act of performing the ritual itself provide a sense of agency and hope in matters otherwise beyond their control? You might ponder how often the line between superstition, psychological placebo, and genuine spiritual belief blurred in the ancient mind. This inquiry forces you to consider the role of magic not just as a quaint historical oddity, but as a deeply human response to universal desires and anxieties, reflecting a world where the boundaries of what was possible were far more porous than they are for you today. In matters of love and lust, if conventional methods failed, the Romans were not above trying to bend the very fabric of reality to their will. Leaving the shadowy world of Roman love magic behind, your journey now shifts focus to a profound cultural current that shaped much of Roman life, including its sexual attitudes, the pervasive influence of Greek culture, while Rome built an empire and developed its own unique legal and administrative systems. Its intellectual, artistic, and philosophical landscape was deeply indebted to Greece. This wasn't just about admiring Greek statues. It was about internalizing Greek ideas, and nowhere is this more evident than in the nuanced ways Roman society approached desire, pleasure, and various forms of sexual expression. It's a fundamental historical truth that Rome, having conquered Greece politically, found itself captivated by Greek culture, often adopting and adapting Greek customs, philosophies, and artistic forms. In terms of sexuality, this meant the Romans inherited, or at least heavily interacted with, Greek attitudes that were often quite liberal compared to some other ancient societies. For example, the Greek acceptance of paiderasty sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys within certain social and educational contexts significantly influenced Roman practices, leading to the Roman male's comfort with same-sex relations that we discussed earlier, particularly the active role. With younger, lower-status males, this was not a direct copy. The Romans integrated these ideas through their own lens of power and status, but the Greek influence provided a foundational framework for their often complex views. Here's a subtle but pervasive detail of this cultural absorption. The concept of the symposium, the Greek drinking party, was adopted by the Romans as the convivium or banquet. While the Romans made it their own, often grander and more excessive, the underlying social and indeed sexual dynamics often echoed their Hellenic origins. In Greek symposia, philosophical discussion and entertainment often intertwined with heavy drinking and, for men, opportunities for homoerotic interactions with younger boys or male prostitutes. When the Romans adopted this institution, they also absorbed, to varying degrees, these associated behaviors and expectations, sometimes with their own Roman flair for opulence and indulgence. It wasn't just the architecture and sculpture that the Romans borrowed. It was also the frameworks for their social and sexual leisure, making the evening's entertainment much more than just a meal. Significant debate among ancient historians revolves around the extent to which Roman sexual practices were a direct imitation or continuation of Greek norms, versus how much they developed unique Roman characteristics. Did the Romans truly embrace Greek sexual fluidity, or did they merely put a Roman, more pragmatic and hierarchical spin on it? One might ask if the seeming tolerance for certain types of same-sex relationships in Rome was simply a result of Greek influence, or if Roman social structures would have allowed for it regardless, merely shaping its form. This inquiry challenges you to discern the genuine adaptations from the superficial borrowings, illustrating the complex interplay of cultural diffusion and local innovation in shaping human behavior, including the intimate acts that define a society. The Roman relationship with Greek culture was rarely passive. It was a dynamic process of appropriation, reinterpretation, and ultimately transformation, creating a sexual landscape that was distinctly Roman, yet undeniably tinged with Hellenic hues. Having observed the profound Hellenic undercurrents shaping Roman sexuality, your journey now turns to the voices of dissent within Roman society, moralists and their constant laments. You might be thinking, amidst all this apparent openness and indulgence, was no one gasping in shock? Oh, they certainly were. A consistent chorus of Roman writers, philosophers, and politicians perpetually bemoaned what they perceived as the moral decay of their age, particularly focusing on sexual excess, luxury, and the supposed decline of traditional Roman virtues. These were the ancient world's equivalent of newspaper columnists shaking their fists at kids these days. It's a frequently emphasized point in Roman literature that many prominent Roman authors, particularly from the late Republic and early Empire, engaged in fierce moralizing, condemning what they saw as widespread decadence and depravity. Figures like Juvenal, Seneca, and Tacitus, in their satires, philosophical treatises, and historical accounts, repeatedly contrasted the supposed moral purity and austere discipline of old Rome with the perceived corruption and hedonism of their contemporary society. They lambasted everything from extravagant banquets, remember those orgiastic feasts, to widespread adultery and a perceived effeminacy among men. For them, a decline in traditional sexual morality was not merely a personal failing, but a direct threat to the very stability and strength of the Roman state. Imagine reading endless rants about how young people are ruining the country, but in elegant Latin verse delivered with a sneer. Here's a peculiar irony within these moralistic diatribes. Many of the very moralists who condemned sexual indulgence and luxurious living were themselves members of the elite classes, often beneficiaries of the wealth and power that facilitated such excesses. Seneca, for example, despite preaching stoic detachment and moderation, amassed immense personal wealth. Juvenal, while decrying Roman women's perceived promiscuity, did so in poems that were themselves quite explicit in their descriptions of the very behaviors he condemned, perhaps even contributing to their sins. It's a bit like a celebrity chef writing a cookbook about healthy eating while secretly indulging in nightly fast food binges. This hypocrisy raises questions about their true motivations. Were they genuinely concerned moral reformers, or were they performing a social role, seeking to gain intellectual or political standing by criticizing behaviors they themselves might have engaged in, or at least observed closely? A core question for scholars interpreting these texts is whether these moralists accurately reflected the true extent of Roman societal decay and sexual license, or if their writings were exaggerated rhetorical devices designed to provoke and entertain as much as to genuinely reform. Did Rome truly plummet into an abyss of depravity, or were these laments merely a recurring literary trope, a traditional lament for a lost golden age that never truly existed? This inquiry challenges You too read between the lines of ancient polemics, distinguishing between genuine social commentary and dramatic exaggeration. Regardless of their accuracy, the sheer volume and vehemence of these moralistic complaints provide an invaluable insight into the anxieties and internal tensions within Roman society regarding its own changing sexual landscape. They are a loud, often indignant, counter-narrative to the seemingly unbridled permissiveness you've observed, reminding you that not everyone in Rome was comfortable with the way things were heading. Moving from the indignant protests of Roman moralists, your journey now zeroes in on a specific transgression that consistently drew their ire and legal repercussions: infidelity and its consequences. While you've already touched upon the double standards surrounding fidelity in Roman marriage, it's crucial to understand the very real social fallout and legal penalties that could befall individuals, particularly women who strayed from the expected path. It reveals the sharp teeth behind Rome's moral code, even when that code felt unevenly applied. It's a critical element of Roman legal history that adultery, particularly on the part of a wife, was a grave offense with significant legal consequences. Under the Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendis, Julian law on the repression of adultery, enacted by Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE, adultery became a public crime, not just a private matter. A husband was, in certain circumstances, legally permitted to kill an adulterous wife and her lover if caught in flagrante delicto in the act in his own home. More commonly, a husband was legally required to divorce an adulterous wife, and she would lose part of her dowry and be banished to an island. Her lover could also face banishment and loss of property. This was a far cry from a quiet separation. It was a devastating public ruin. Imagine your entire life, your social standing, and your financial security being obliterated by a single transgression, with the full force of the state coming down on you. Here's a peculiar legal loophole that highlights the era's fascinating complexities. While the law was harsh, there was a specific provision known as adultery by accident or stuprim, which applied to sexual relations between a freeborn man and an unmarried freeborn woman, a widow or a virgin. This was considered a lesser offense than adultery with a married woman, as it didn't violate the sanctity of a legitimate marriage or threaten the legitimacy of heirs. It was still illegal, punishable by fines or exile, but it didn't carry the same extreme penalties as adultery. This nuance demonstrates how Roman law meticulously categorized sexual transgressions, with the greatest severity reserved for acts that directly threatened the patriarchal family structure and property rights, rather than simply individual morality. It's almost as if they had a sliding scale of sin, with the biggest penalty reserved for those who messed with the family tree. There is considerable scholarly debate about the effectiveness and actual enforcement of Augustus's adultery laws. Did these strict penalties genuinely curb infidelity, or did they merely force it further underground, making it more clandestine rather than less frequent? Some historians argue that the laws were selectively enforced, often used as political tools against rivals, while others suggest they did have a significant impact on elite behavior, at least initially. You might ponder if the fear of public disgrace and banishment was a greater deterrent than the fear of physical punishment. This ongoing discussion prompts you to consider the practical impact of legal statutes on human behavior and how often the letter of the law can differ from its real-world application, especially when dealing with such deeply ingrained human desires. The consequences of infidelity in Rome underscore that while certain sexual practices were tolerated, others, particularly those that threatened the social order, were met with the full, unforgiving might of Roman law. From the legal consequences of infidelity, your journey through Roman society now takes an unexpected turn, leading you into the brutal, yet undeniably captivating, world of the arena and its most iconic figures, gladiators and their allure. You might think of these fighters as mere entertainers or condemned criminals, but for many Romans, particularly women, gladiators possessed a powerful, often illicit, sexual magnetism that defied social norms and sometimes even led to scandalous affairs. It's a testament to the strange ways desire manifests, even in the most unlikely of places. It's a well-established historical fact that gladiators, despite their enslaved or low-status origins and violent profession, held a powerful fascination for Roman society, particularly for women of all social classes. Their lives were short, brutal, and often ended violently, yet they were celebrities, rock stars of their day, admired for their courage, physical prowess, and exotic origins. Wealthy matrons and even empresses were known to fall for them, sometimes, leaving their respectable husbands for gladiatorial lovers. The sheer danger and raw masculinity they exuded, combined with their tragic circumstances, seemed to create an irresistible mystique. Imagine the Roman equivalent of a pop idol, but one who might literally die for your entertainment, then be available for a tryst after the show. Here's a truly astonishing detail that illustrates this allure. Ancient graffiti, found in places like Pompeii, explicitly names gladiators and praises their sexual prowess. For instance, one piece of graffiti refers to a gladiator named Celadus as the delight of all girls. Another declares Chryses, the net fighter, lord of the girls. These aren't just fan notes. They are direct, public declarations of infatuation, scrawled by women who clearly viewed these fighters as objects of intense sexual desire. It provides a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the popular culture of the time, revealing how deeply these figures permeated the fantasies and affections of Roman women, crossing the immense social chasm between a noblewoman and an enslaved fighter. It makes you wonder what kind of desperate, thrilling notes might be slipped to a modern celebrity if such overt public declarations were still common. Among historians, there is an intriguing discussion about the precise nature of this gladiatorial allure. Was it purely sexual attraction to their physical strength and exoticism, or did it also stem from a deeper psychological fascination with their defiance of death, their ultimate control over their own bodies in the face of brutal fate, or perhaps even their perceived freedom from the societal constraints that bound Roman elites? Some scholars argue that their low status paradoxically made them attractive, as affairs with them carried less social risk for aristocratic women than with men of equal standing, while offering a thrill. This line of inquiry prompts you to consider the complex interplay of power, danger, and taboo in shaping human desire, demonstrating how even in a highly stratified society, the currents of attraction could flow in unexpected and often scandalous directions. The gladiator, in his blood-soaked glory, became an unlikely symbol of forbidden passion in the heart of Rome. Leaving the dust and blood of the arena behind, your journey now ascends to the very pinnacle of Roman power, only to discover that even here, sexual practices were far from conventional. Imperial sexual scandals. You might envision emperors and empresses as paragons of virtue, upholding the moral fiber of the state. The reality, however, is often a tangled web of ambition, indulgence, and outright debauchery, meticulously documented by ancient historians who clearly relished every salacious detail. The private lives of the Roman elite, particularly those in power, frequently became public spectacles of shocking behavior, defying the very moral codes they were supposed to embody. It's a well-chronicled aspect of Roman history that numerous emperors and empresses were accused, rightly or wrongly, of scandalous sexual conduct that went far beyond mere infidelity. These accounts, often found in the works of Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, describe everything from incest and serial polygamy to public orgies and extreme fetishes. For example, Emperor Tiberius was famously depicted as indulging in depraved acts on the island of Capri, while the Empress Messalina, wife of Claudius, was notorious for her alleged insatiable sexual appetite, even supposedly competing with a common prostitute in a sex contest. These stories, whether entirely factual or embellished, became part of the imperial narrative, shaping public perception and often serving as a tool for political opponents to discredit rulers. Imagine the shock and whispers that would ripple through the Senate or the common populace if similar tales emerged about your own head of state. Here's a particularly notorious and widely recounted detail concerning the Emperor Elagabalus, who reigned briefly in the early 3rd century CE. His behavior was so unconventional that he stands out even among the notoriously eccentric Roman emperors. He was said to have prostituted himself in taverns and brothels, taken male lovers, married several women and at least one man, and even considered undergoing a sex change operation. While some of these accounts are certainly exaggerated for dramatic effect by hostile historians, they reflect a ruler who seemed determined to transgress every conceivable sexual and gender norm of his time, often in full public view. It's a jaw-dropping example of imperial power being used not just for political ends, but for a radical, almost performative, subversion of societal expectations, making him arguably the most sexually provocative figure in Roman history. There is considerable scholarly debate regarding the accuracy and bias of these sensationalized accounts of imperial sexual scandals. Were these historians truly objective chroniclers, or were they motivated by political agendas, personal animosity, or simply a desire to entertain their readers with juicy gossip? How much of what we read is factual, and how much is literary embellishment designed to paint a particular emperor as a tyrant or a degenerate? One might argue that the very existence of such pervasive rumors, regardless of their absolute truth, reveals a public fascination and anxiety about the unbridled power wielded by the emperors and the potential for its abuse, including in the sexual realm. This discussion prompts you to critically evaluate historical sources and consider how power, morality, and scandal have always been intertwined, making the Roman imperial court a stage for the most shocking dramas of all. The walls of the palaces, you realize, concealed as much as they revealed. Descending from the scandalous heights of imperial debauchery, your journey through Roman sexual practices now takes you into the joyous, chaotic embrace of Saturnalia and its inversions. If much of Roman life was governed by strict social hierarchies and moral codes, this annual festival was a deliberate, exuberant suspension of those rules, a period of sanctioned revelry where the world was turned upside down. It was a time when slaves could sit at their masters' tables, dice were freely thrown, and social inhibitions were gleefully cast aside, often leading to a general loosening of sexual decorum. It's a deeply ingrained historical tradition that Saturnalia was one of the most popular and widely celebrated Roman festivals, typically held in mid-December, honoring the god Saturn. It was a week-long, though sometimes shorter or longer public holiday characterized by feasting, gift-giving, gambling, and a general atmosphere of merriment and license. The most distinctive feature was the temporary inversion of social roles. Masters would serve their slaves at meals. Slaves were permitted to wear masters' clothes and speak freely without fear of punishment. And public gambling, usually restricted, was openly tolerated. This temporary chaos was seen as a way to commemorate a mythical golden age of equality and abundance, and to purify the social order by letting off steam before returning to normal life. Imagine your boss serving you dinner and then inviting you to a lively game of poker, all while shouting jokes at each other. Here's a particularly vivid detail that highlights the sexual implications of Saturnalia's inversions. Amidst the general loosening of rules, there was often an increased indulgence in sexual activity, or at least a more overt display of desire, with social constraints temporarily relaxed, and an atmosphere of celebration and license permeating the city. Opportunities for flirtation, illicit encounters, and general merrymaking abounded, while not explicitly orgies in the dramatic sense. The festive atmosphere, combined with ample wine and the blurring of traditional boundaries, certainly created a fertile ground for sexual dalliances that might be frowned upon during the rest of the year. It was a time for letting one's hair down, and perhaps a few other things too, in a way that felt sanctioned by the spirit of the festival itself. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the exhilarating freedom that came with a week of rule-breaking. A fascinating point of discussion among historians is whether the deliberate inversions of Saturnalia truly functioned as a harmless release valve, reinforcing the social order by temporarily subverting it, or if it genuinely reflected a deeper, latent Roman desire for a less rigid, more egalitarian and sexually permissive society. Did the festival merely channel otherwise disruptive urges, or did it allow for a brief glimpse into an alternate social reality that the Romans secretly yearned for? You might ponder if the controlled chaos of Saturnalia was a masterful piece of social engineering, or a yearly acknowledgement that human nature, in all its complexity, needed an annual permission slip to truly express itself. This inquiry encourages you to consider the psychology behind public festivals and how temporary transgressions can often serve to underscore, rather than undermine, the very rules they seem to break, providing a fascinating counterpoint to the rigid structures elsewhere. In Roman life, emerging from the intoxicating inversions of Saturnalia, your comprehensive journey through Roman sexual practices now turns to a broader, more sweeping perspective. The evolution of norms over centuries. You've observed a multitude of shocking, fascinating, and sometimes contradictory behaviors. But it's important to remember that ancient Rome wasn't a static entity. It spanned over 1,000 years, from its humble beginnings as a republic to its vast imperial zenith and eventual decline. Just as its empire expanded and transformed, so too did its societal values, moral outlooks, and consequently, its sexual mores. What was acceptable in one era might have been scandalous in another, and vice versa. It's a crucial historical understanding that Roman sexual norms were not monolithic, but underwent significant shifts and evolutions throughout the Republic. An empire. Early Republican Rome, for instance, often idealized a more austere, conservative morality, emphasizing male chastity before marriage and strict female fidelity. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held immense moral and legal authority. However, as Rome grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, particularly from the late Republic onwards, there appears to have been a gradual loosening of these strictures. Divorce became easier, concubinage more prevalent, and urban life offered more opportunities for diverse sexual encounters. Imagine the generations of Romans watching their society change, perhaps lamenting, like the moralists we've discussed, the good old days that were slipping away. This long arc of change complicates any simplistic notion of Roman sexuality. Here's a telling demographic shift that profoundly impacted Roman sexual practices. The declining birth rates among the Roman elite during the late Republic and early Empire. This was a source of major concern for emperors like Augustus, who even enacted legislation such as the Lex Julia et Papia Papia to encourage marriage and childbearing among the senatorial and equestrian classes. While not directly about sexual acts, the failure of elite families to produce enough legitimate heirs highlighted a shift in priorities, perhaps towards personal pleasure, luxury, or political maneuvering over traditional family expansion. This demographic anxiety speaks volumes about how changing social behaviors, including sexual ones, had tangible consequences for the state and prompted attempts at legislative intervention. It's almost as if the government was saying, please, for the good of Rome, have more babies and less ... that. Academics frequently analyze whether these shifts in Roman sexual norms were primarily driven by internal, social, and economic changes, such as increased urbanization and wealth, or if they were also influenced by external factors, like the influx of diverse cultures from the conquered territories, particularly Greece, as we've already explored. Was the evolution a natural, internal progression, or a consequence of Rome becoming a vast melting pot of ideas and behaviors? One might ask if the perceived decline was truly a moral decay, or simply a redefinition of what constituted acceptable behavior in a rapidly changing world, with different expectations for marriage and relationships, perhaps even more diverse expressions of desire. This deep dive into the long-term trends compels you to appreciate the dynamism of historical societies, recognizing that even the most seemingly stable cultures are in a constant state of flux, reshaping their most intimate practices across the ebb and flow of centuries. The Rome of Caesar was not entirely the Rome of Hadrian, and certainly not the Rome of Romulus. Having traversed the long and winding road of Roman sexual norms, witnessing their evolution through centuries, your journey now reaches its final, reflective destination, the enduring legacy and modern echoes of these ancient practices. You might be tempted to dismiss everything you've learned as relics of a distant, bizarre past, utterly irrelevant to your world. Yet, as you consider the full spectrum of Roman attitudes towards desire, marriage, power, and the body, you begin to see subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, ways in which their complex legacy continues to resonate, surprisingly, in your own contemporary society. It's a powerful, often uncomfortable, historical legacy that many aspects of Roman sexual culture, particularly their pragmatic approach to legality and power dynamics, have subtly influenced subsequent Western legal and moral frameworks, even if those frameworks later tried to suppress or reinterpret the more explicit aspects. For instance, Roman law, with its emphasis on property, consent or lack thereof for enslaved individuals, and male dominance within marriage, laid foundational stones for legal systems that persisted for centuries, shaping notions of family, legitimacy, and transgression. Even concepts of adultery as a legal offense, distinct from other sexual acts, find roots in Roman legislation. Imagine how many unspoken assumptions in your own legal codes or cultural norms might be distant echoes of Roman pragmatism even if those roots are now obscured by layers of later moralizing. Here's a curious modern echo that highlights this continuity. While modern Western societies often pride themselves on their sexual liberation, the Roman emphasis on aesthetics, physical perfection, and even the public display of bodies, think of athletes, models, or even social media culture, bears a striking, albeit distant, resemblance to certain Roman ideals. Consider the modern fascination with idealized male and female forms, the booming fitness industry, or even the carefully curated public images found on platforms like Instagram. While the context is entirely different, the underlying drive to present and admire the physical form, and sometimes to explicitly or implicitly sexualize it, connects directly back to Roman attitudes where the body, in its strength and beauty, was often a source of public display and admiration, sometimes for purely aesthetic reasons, sometimes for erotic ones. It makes you wonder how much of your modern culture is just ancient human nature in new clothes. Contemporary scholarship increasingly engages with how Roman sexual history challenges simplistic narratives of progress in human sexuality. Did Roman society, with its greater comfort around nudity, open discussions of sexual acts in literature, and pragmatic approach to prostitution, possess a certain freedom that later, more puritanical eras lost, or was their freedom inextricably linked to oppressive structures like slavery and patriarchy, making it fundamentally different from modern ideals of liberation? One might argue that understanding Roman sexual culture forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that societies can be simultaneously advanced in some areas and deeply repressive in others. This final reflection prompts you to consider the complex, non-linear trajectory of human sexual history, reminding you that there is no single, simple path towards enlightenment. The shadows of ancient Rome, with all their shocking and surprising details, continue to linger, prompting you to question your own assumptions about what is truly natural, moral, or modern. Your journey through Roman sexuality, then, is not just about understanding them, but perhaps understanding a little more about yourself and the complex tapestry of human desire across all ages.